Good day, esteemed students, and welcome to a critical and often misunderstood area of New Testament studies and church history. We are addressing the profound, indeed tectonic, significance of the year. Ad 70, the year the Roman legions under Titus Vespasian besieged, conquered, and utterly destroyed Jerusalem and its magnificent temple. This event, far from being a mere footnote in Roman history, is the colossal, anchoring historical moment that elucidates much of the New Testament, solidifies the early church's trajectory, and most importantly, provides the key interpretive framework for Jesus' most intense prophetic discourses, particularly the one recorded in Luke 21:5-24. The Bible specifically posits that the vast majority of prophecies concerning the coming of the Son of Man, the destruction of that generation, and the end of the ages, specifically the Mosaic age, were consummated in the judgment God poured out upon first century Judaism with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. This framework allows us to read texts like Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13, not as blueprints for our distant future, but as immediate, urgent warnings directed to the very people who stood before Jesus. It transforms them from vague, millennia-spanning predictions into laser-focused historical prophecies. The discourse in Luke 21 begins with an almost innocent, yet utterly fateful observation by the disciples. Luke records, "And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, 'As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" Imagine the scene. They are standing near, or perhaps even in, the dazzling Herodian temple complex, a marvel of the ancient world. Josephus describes the temple's gleaming white stone and gold plating as an almost unbearable sight under the Mediterranean sun. The disciples, being faithful Jews, understood the temple not merely as a building, but as the cosmic, geopolitical, and theological center of the universe, the dwelling place of God, the nexus of the Abrahamic covenant, and the guarantor of Israel's favored status. To speak of its destruction was to speak of the end of the world as they knew it. Their immediate response betrays their ingrained covenantal worldview. "Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" The disciples conflated three distinct concepts into one singular cataclysmic event: the destruction of the temple city, the immediate prophecy Jesus had just given, the end of the age. They assumed the destruction of the temple, the symbol of the Mosaic age, must signal the end of all time, and the second coming messianic kingdom. They believed that the messianic kingdom would be established following this singular event. Jesus' genius in Luke 21 is not simply predicting the future. It is instructing the church on how to transition from the Mosaic covenant centered on the temple into the new covenant centered on Christ. The prophecy serves as a theological bridge, not an apocalyptic dead end. Jesus dedicates a significant portion of his response to warning against misinterpreting the general turbulence of history as the ultimate eschatological climax. He outlines a series of birth pangs, Odin, troubles that must occur before the final event, but are not the event itself, warning against false messiahs and panic. "Take heed that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and 'the time is at hand,' do not go after them." Wars and uprisings. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. And natural disasters. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences, and there will be terrifying sights and great signs from heaven. These signs serve a double purpose. The proximate fulfillment notes that the first century was notoriously tumultuous, especially in Judea, with documented famines, Acts 11:28, multiple messianic pretenders, Theudas, the Egyptian prophet mentioned in Acts 21:38, and political revolts against Rome. Jesus is telling his disciples, expect trouble, but do not mistake this normal yet intensified historical trouble for the unique sign of Jerusalem's doom. The second purpose is that the church prepares, as the larger context of Luke 21 shifts the focus entirely from cosmic signs to Christian persecution. Jesus prepares them for arrest, trials, betrayal, and martyrdom, all of which were experienced by the apostles and the early church before AD 70. For example, the death of James, Peter's imprisonment, Paul's trials. The point is this: persecution is the sign of the church's life and mission, not the sign of the world's destruction. God permits persecution to allow for testimony. This will be a time for you to bear witness. This section firmly establishes the partial preterist's core argument. The end Jesus is talking about is not the end of space and time, but the end of a covenantal system, the end of the Mosaic age, and the signs leading up to it are historical and verifiable. This leads us to the climactic, unequivocal, and geographically specific section of the prophecy, the unmistakable, proximate sign of Jerusalem's doom. Verses 20 to 24 shift abruptly from the general troubles of the birth pangs to the one concrete, verifiable, and urgent sign that demands immediate action from his followers. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter the city, for these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. This passage is the very heart of the vengeance of God and its connection to AD 70. The sign is not celestial, nor is it subject to theological debate. It is an unmistakable historical military maneuver, Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Historical accounts, especially Josephus, the Jewish war, provide the perfect fulfillment. Cestius Gallus in AD 66 marched on Jerusalem, but inexplicably withdrew his forces just as the city was ripe for the taking. This temporary retreat provided the critical window of opportunity that Jesus had prophetically outlined. Early Christian historians like Eusebius record that Christians in Jerusalem, recalling Jesus' explicit warning, utilized this brief respite to flee the city and retreat to Pella, a city in the Decapolis, on the other side of the Jordan River. Their literal immediate obedience to the command to flee to the mountains saved them from the horrors that followed when Titus returned in AD 70. The outcome is terrifyingly specific. Its desolation has come near, and these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. These are days of vengeance. Divine judgment upon the unrepentant first century generation who had rejected and crucified the Christ. Compare this with Matthew 23:36. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. The vengeance is not against Rome, which was merely God's instrument, but against the old covenant system that was corrupt and ready to be dissolved. This judgment constitutes the fulfillment of prophecy laid out across the Old Testament from Deuteronomy 28 to Daniel 9, realizing the covenant curses for disobedience in the most spectacular fashion. This was a historical catastrophe, as Josephus estimates that over 1 million Jews died in the siege and subsequent fighting, and nearly 100,000 were taken captive. They did lie, fall by the edge of the sword, and be led captive among all nations. Exactly as Jesus predicted, the great Jewish diaspora was confirmed by this definitive event. Having established the unmistakable, geographically specific signs of Jerusalem's pending doom, the surrounding of the city by armies, and the subsequent need for immediate flight, Jesus dramatically shifts the register of his prophecy in Poitiers, Part 2. The crucial interruption, the Son of Man's coming. Luke 21:25 to 27. He moves from the concrete, observable actions of Roman legions to language that seems, on the surface, utterly apocalyptic and global. Cosmic collapse. If the partial preterist interpretation of Luke 21:20 to 24 focuses on the historical acts of judgment, our interpretation of Luke 21:25 to 27 must now focus on the theological meanings of that judgment. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Luke 21:25 to 27, ESV. To the modern Western reader, this instantly conjures images of supernovae and physical destruction. This is the crucial interruption, the point where most traditional interpretations lose the thread of Jesus' context and audience. The key to maintaining scholarly consistency is to realize that this language is not about astronomy. It is about Chiwetim covenantal symbolism. Drawn directly from the Old Testament prophets, the prophetic code, cosmic language as covenantal collapse. When ancient prophets spoke of the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and the stars falling, they were using deconstruction imagery or apocalyptic metaphor to describe the violent overthrow and collapse of a political, national, or religious authority. For example, Isaiah 13:10 describes the judgment of Babylon, and Ezekiel 32:7 through 8 describes the judgment of Egypt, using precisely this language without literal celestial events. In this prophetic code, the Quichua heavens represented the ruling powers, kings, priests, authorities, and the earth represented the populace and the established system. Therefore, when Jesus speaks of signs in sun and moon and stars, and the quiet powers of the heavens will be shaken, he is declaring the impending covenantal deconstruction of first century Judaism, the violent final end of the temple-centered Mosaic age. The sun of the old covenant system was about to set forever, and the stars, its leaders and institutions, were about to fall with the distress of nations centered around the judgment upon this people, Luke 21:23, and the destruction of this city, Luke 21:20. This symbolic interpretation reaches its powerful climax in Luke 21:27. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Under the partial preterist view, this passage is not a prediction of a physical bodily descent of Christ onto the Mount of Olives in our future. It is a direct and definitive fulfillment of Daniel 7:13 to 14. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days. God, a scene of vindication, enthronement, and judicial investiture, describing Christ's ascension and his consequent exercise of judgmental authority from that throne. Therefore, Jesus' declaration must be understood as a coming in judgment upon the hostile authorities that rejected him. The imagery of God coming in a cloud throughout the Old Testament, e.g., Isaiah 19:1 on Egypt, is consistently an image of judgment, manifestation, and punitive presence.
The coming in AD 70 was the authoritative judicial manifestation of the enthroned Son of Man exercising his newly bestowed dominion to crush the temple system. This coming was seen not with the physical eye, but with the eye of faith, manifested through the undeniable historical evidence of the temple's systematic destruction. The significance of Luke 21:25-27, fulfilled in AD 70, is that it definitively marks the consummation days of Christ's judgment on the Old Covenant world, proving Christ's immediate authority. He began ruling immediately after his resurrection, and demonstrating the finality of the old age. The judgment separated the New Covenant church from its Jewish roots theologically and historically, allowing the New Covenant to stand unopposed. We now turn our attention to the profound theological consequences of the events described in Luke 21:20-27 in part 3. The end of the old age and the birth of the new. The final devastating fulfillment of the temple's prophecy in AD 70. This event was the definitive, God-ordained closure of the Mosaic covenant and the irreversible establishment of the new covenant. The core message of AD 70 is, the old has passed away, behold, the new has come. The Epistle to the Hebrews provides the crucial theological commentary, arguing that the old covenant system was temporary and deficient, and the destruction of the temple in AD 70 served as the final, violent punctuation mark on this argument. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Hebrews 8:13 ESV. The temple's destruction marked the end of four critical aspects of the old age. It ended the Levitical priesthood, Hebrews 7:11-28, because no temple meant no required rituals, confirming Christ as our eternal high priest. It abolished the sacrificial system. Hebrews 9-10, because AD 70 made mandatory sacrifices impossible, validating that Christ's one perfect sacrifice had fulfilled and rendered null all previous offerings. Where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. Hebrews 10:18. It removed the geographic center of worship. John 4:21-23. Confirming that worship is now in spirit and truth, not tied to Jerusalem, and it revoked national status as God's sole people. Confirming the new spiritual Israel, the church, as the true inheritor of the promises. The AD 70 event, therefore, acts as a massive historical punctuation mark, validating the theological claims already laid out in the Pauline and Petrine epistles. A partial preterist reading of the Olivet Discourse anchors itself on two key temporal phrases, this generation and the end of the age. Jesus emphatically stated that all these things will come upon this generation. Matt 23:36 and 24:34, referring simply and straightforwardly to the living contemporaries of Jesus, see AD 30 to AD 70. The judgment for rejecting the Messiah was reserved for the very people who carried the collective guilt of that rejection, fulfilling the vengeance that's mentioned in Luke 21:22. The historical fulfillment precisely within the 40-year window ensures the absolute faithfulness and accuracy of Jesus' prophecy. The disciples had inquired about the sign of the close of the age. Suntelia tu ionos. Matt 24:3. This phrase refers to the end of a specific epoch or period, not the end of the physical universe, cosmos. The age that closed in AD 70 was the Mosaic age, the era defined by the law, the temple, and the Old Covenant. The birth that followed was the establishment of the Gospel age, marking the true commencement of the New Covenant era in its fullness. The definitive closure of the Old Age in AD 70 provided the early church with crucial theological and practical liberty, serving as a theological mandate for the church's liberty and universalism. This included freedom from legalism by removing the physical magnet of the law forever. The universal mission validated by confirming the shift to a worldwide universal faith without the geographic constraints of the temple, and establishing worship in truth and power by necessitating the church's identity as the temple of the Holy Spirit, 1 Cor 3:16. AD 70 was the divinely authored historical event that made the theology of the New Testament possible in practice, guaranteeing the final triumph of grace over the law. The historical judgment of AD 70, the fulfillment of Luke 21, was, for the nascent church, its true and final liberation day. Part 4. The theological significance for the early church. Endau. While Christ's death and resurrection secured salvation in principle, the destruction of the temple secured the church's identity and mission in practice and in history. The church could now step out from the shadow of its Jewish origins, fully embracing its radical, universal identity as the ecclesia, Nepsilon Kappa Kappa Lambda Yetal Sigma Decute Iota Alpha. The significance is summarized by three shifts, the first being definitive separation, the historical schism. Prior to AD 70, Christianity was often viewed as merely another Jewish sect, which created internal confusion and external vulnerability despite Roman tolerance, religio licita. The destruction of the temple solved this crisis of identity, creating a physical rupture where the visible center of Judaism was gone, forcing rabbinic Judaism to recenter on the synagogue without a temple, while Christianity retained its center, the ascended Christ. The prophetic vindication, the survival of the Pella community, demonstrated that Christians were guided by true prophecy and stood high outside the condemned Old Covenant system, leading to a permanent historical schism. The second shift was radical universalism, legitimation of the Gentile mission. While the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, provided the doctrinal answer, AD 70 provided the historical and functional necessity for Gentile inclusion, the removal of the law's magnet. The physical temple ended the powerful force drawing Jewish Christians back towards rituals. The event served as the ultimate divine sanction of Paul's gospel of denied justification by faith alone, Galatians 2:16, resulting in the clear realization that there was neither Jew nor Greek, Galatians 3:28. The destruction of Jerusalem, the center, confirmed a global mandate, not a local franchise. Establishing the New Covenant Church as the single, global, multi-ethnic, an unconstrained vehicle for God's saving grace. The third shift was solidifying the New Testament canon, the closing of the apostolic age. The Olivet Discourse served as a powerful prophetic test for the apostolic writings. The accurate predictions in the Gospels, written near AD 70, lent immense credibility to Christ's teachings. AD 70 created the need for written authority because the direct living connection to the apostles was fading, necessitating a solidified written record of the new covenant revelation. The eschatological shift confirmed that the end of the age had passed, focusing remaining prophecy purely on the future physical second coming, the parousia, distinct from the imminent covenantal judgment that had been fulfilled. In summary, AD 70 was the indispensable historical bridge from the old covenant to the new, providing the church with independence, freedom, and the universal legitimacy needed for its mission. We conclude our comprehensive study by addressing the final crucial phrase of Jesus' prophecy in Luke 21:24. The clause that acts as the theological and historical bridge connecting the fulfilled judgment of AD 70 to the ongoing life of the church today. Part 5. The Church Today, Understanding the Times of the Gentiles. Having established that the core prophecy was consummated within the first century, we now turn to the statement concerning the aftermath. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Luke 21:24 ESV. The phrase, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, describes a twofold reality put into effect by the Roman victory. Literal historical reality and symbolic theological reality. The trampling, potamon, denotes devastation and occupation by successive Gentile powers, Rome, Byzantium, etc., confirming that the Old Covenant's earthly center was permanently removed. Symbolically, the trampling represents the displacement of Old Covenant particularism by the New Covenant universalism. This trampling is the condition that endures until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The phrase, the times of the Gentiles, kai roi ethnon, refers to a designated epoch of Gentile opportunity, the entire gospel age, mirrored by Paul in Romans 11:25, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The times of the Gentiles is the duration of the worldwide mission, continuing until the parousia. Crucially, the core prophecy of Luke 21:5-27 was fulfilled in AD 70 watts, and the times of the Gentiles is the consequence of that fulfillment, the subsequent age of global mission and freedom. Understanding this distinction provides the contemporary church with immense confidence and clarity. The prophetic trustworthiness of Christ is confirmed by the AD 70 fulfillment. We have missionary urgency, as the primary eschatological focus is on the completion of the global mission, not celestial panic. Finally, we have clarity on the future, distinguishing the past covenantal judgment, AD 70, from the future physical consummation, the parousia, resurrection, and eternal state. The trampling is the ongoing historical sign of the former covenant's defeat. The times are the victorious era of the new covenant's global triumph. The church today is confidently advancing the kingdom, knowing the old age has already been judged, removed, and replaced by the glorious reign of the enthroned Son of Man. Our marching orders are clear. Straighten up, raise your heads, and occupy until he comes. for the final bodily consummation. I look forward to reading your comments and answering your questions in the comment section. Peace be with you.